Time to take a look at Nebelwerfer Tactics. Ideally watch my video on Nebelwerfer first or again. It is not required, yet will provide you with more context, background and different Nebelwerfer variants. Now, the name Nebelwerfer literally translated is fog thrower, since one of the original missions of the Nebelwerfer was to fire rockets with smoke and gas. After all, both behave rather similar. Additionally, troops had to decontaminate terrain as well. Yet over the course of the war, they also used rockets with high explosives and flame oil. Note that the early Nebelwerfers were mainly large mortars, yet with the introduction of the Nebelwerfer 41, originally called Nebelwerfer D, they became rocket launchers. The following designs came in various calibers like 15, 21, 28, 30 and 32 centimeters. These variants are covered in more detail in my first video. Nebelwerfers were basically rocket artillery, so let us look at some major differences between Nebelwerfer and regular artillery. Nebelwerfer were fired with electricity, whereas regular artillery usually was not. Nebelwerfer batteries usually had more rocket launchers than artillery batteries had guns, but it also depended on the variant. Additionally, at least some Nebelwerfer batteries were equipped with an anti-tank gun. This was due to the fact that most Nebelwerfer had a minimum range and usually unsuited for direct fire missions, although there were exceptions. In contrast, most artillery could be used in direct fire missions, and some also had armor-piercing shells as well. Although most Nebelwerfers had a higher payload than artillery in relation to the caliber, this was due to the fact that the rockets were rather thin, since they didn't have to withstand the enormous pressure within a gun tube. This also meant that Nebelwerfer rockets could not penetrate the ground and were unsuited for engaging cover targets, unlike regular artillery. Nebelwerfers, due to the large flame trails and large amount of smoke produced, were also more susceptible to counter battery fire. As such, changing the firing position was more crucial. Let us look at tactics now. At first we look at firing smoke, and then we look at how high explosive ammo was used. Firing smoke might be underestimated, yet as mentioned in various of my videos, unlike in computer games and movies, in war it is often enough to suppress the enemy or at least to prevent him from being effective. This is also clearly reflected in the armor regulation. The purpose of creating a smoke screen is to blind the enemy, that means to rob him of his sight, thereby paralyzing or hindering his combat capabilities. And if you like German army regulations, I might have something for you. Currently we have a crowdfunding campaign running for the translation of the Sturmgewehr 44 platoon of the Grenadier Company from November 1944. It comes with additional documents, and of course, besides the translation, the original German texts are included as well. But back to smoke. In some cases, even smoke could have a strong effect on the enemy. As this report about the use of Nebelwerfers during the Battle of France notes. Somewhat more surprising was the psychological effect of the Nebelwerfer battalions. In some cases, fog bombardment caused the enemy to flee in panic. The moral impact of fog, especially in combat for houses and bases, was sometimes surprisingly successful. Accuracy while deploying smoke is of lesser importance than with high explosive fire. Yet the closer the smoke is towards the enemy, the better. The armor regulation notes, the aim should always be that the fog cloud should also cover the enemy, because the enemy must then put on the gas mask, because he is endangered by projectile fragments and flying particles of the projectile filling, and because the dense smoke greatly impairs or even eliminates the influence of the leaders and subordinate leaders. Wind and terrain have a strong influence on how smoke behaves. The regulation noted that depending on these factors, either a Nebelwand, meaning smoke screen, or a Nebelzone, meaning smoke screened area, should be created. Here you can see typical examples of a smoke screen with wind from the side and with diagonal wind. In contrast, here's an example for a smoke screened area with wind from behind and with diagonal wind. So how were the smoke screen and the smoke screened area defined in the army regulations? First, the smoke screen. The smoke screen looks like a curtain. It allows the blinding of large targets with most economic use of ammunition. However, it only occurs when the direction of the wind makes it possible to line up the length of the individual fog plumes. And here the smoke screened area. The smoke screened area has the effect of a carpet. It requires increased use of ammunition, increases the effect in depth, but impairs the effect in width. The prerequisite for it is a wind direction that allows the width of the individual fog flags to be aligned. So what about the high explosive fire? Here the goal was firing of explosives is intended to incapacitate the opponent, destroy his equipment, or stop his fire activity for a certain period of time. So let us look at what instructions were suggested against what targets. Note, this regulation was still for the 10 cm Nebelwerfer, which was a mortar, not a rocket launcher. As such, there might have been changes, but at least in the German military archive I didn't find a newer version of the firing regulations, Schießvorschrift. Anyway, let us look at what we have. The first category are visible targets outside of cover. For heavy infantry weapons and riflemen, it is noted, when fighting heavy infantry weapons, it is particularly important to hold down the observation positions if the firing positions cannot be grasped, as this would seriously disrupt the combat actions of the weapons belonging to them. Additionally, it is noted that against machine guns and guns, adjustment fire should be conducted only broadly, and it is often advantageous to prepare fire against these targets only to ambush them at crucial stages of the battle. For engaging enemy infantry, the regulation notes that under the range of 1000 meters, no adjustment fire is necessary, and if friendly and enemy infantry engages each other, it is important to concentrate the fire on the rear elements of the enemy, if friendly troops could be hit. The next category are targets of opportunity, which are described as marching columns, troop assemblies, infantry support guns, machine guns, and anti-tank guns doing limbering or unlimbering, staff units, limbers, etc. Depending on the speed of the target, a proper range interval should be chosen. Also, it may often be appropriate to fire at a point in the terrain, bridge, bottleneck, or something similar, for which the target is likely to pass, and in the case of a surprise fire, to switch to fire for effect when the target has reached that point. This procedure also ensures surprise for the surprise fire. Against heavy infantry weapons and riflemen in simple field positions, it is noted that only a direct hit is successful if the position is rather weak as well, referring to the fact that the detonator is very sensitive. It is noted if a probability to hit is below a certain threshold that the required amount of ammo is usually not justified. If the target is engaged, precise adjustment is required. What about using Nebelwerfers against tanks? Well, in November 1942, the General Inspector of the Nebeltruppe issued a report on how Nebelwerfers could be used against tanks. The Nebelwerfers were rather inaccurate, as such they should be used at enemy tank concentrations. The effect of such an attack could lead the enemy forces to scatter or even turn back. Additionally, there were reported cases where tanks were set on fire. The assumption was that this was likely due to the ignition of gases and/or fuel. Furthermore, near misses could knock out the tank crews as well. And finally, such attacks would separate supporting infantry from the tanks, hence the tanks would be far more vulnerable against friendly infantry. Furthermore, smoke could also blind tanks, but this was highly dependent on the wind situation, since it could also blind the friendly anti-tank guns as well. Generally, the Nebelwerfer was considered ill-suited for fighting enemy artillery due to its inaccurate fire, yet if circumstances allowed it, it should be used, although it was stated that the fire that should be provided by Nebelwerfers versus artillery could only be categorized as Störungsfeuer, meaning harassing fire. As such, its effect was limited. Now, finally, we take a look at a typical position. The Army regulation for the heavy battery notes, crowding together of the Werfer in too small a space is to be avoided, as well as too wide a setup, which makes fire control difficult in strong winds and lively combat activity. The distance between the Werfer should be 25 to 30 meters. So here we have the basic outline from the top of a 20 cm/32 cm Nebelwerfer firing position. The enemy is toward the right side. The Nebelwerfer 28/32 cm should be positioned here. The space for the Nebelwerfer should be about 5 meters in length. Now the two larger areas on the left and right are for ammunition. They should have a depth of 1.3 meters. The areas further away from the enemy, namely here, are the cover for the crews. These should have a depth of 1.8 to 2 meters. So regular trench depth. Note that the trenches at the front are less deep, but the earth banks provide additional protection. These earth banks should have a height of around 0.6 meters. Unlike the trenches to the back, those near the armor storage are only about 1.3 meters deep. Also, during construction, keep in mind that during the entrenchment work, the Werfer are to be placed about 5 meters in front of the plant covers so that the battery is always ready to fire. The drawings should only be taken as a guide. The details of the positions are to be developed irregularly and adapted to the respective terrain. For more information on German field fortifications, be sure to check out this video, by the way, where we also cover infantry, tank and artillery positions as well. Well, I hope you learned something new about Nebelwerfer tactics and how to set up a proper Nebelwerfer position in your garden if you fancy that. A big thank you here to my Patreon and Subscribestar supporters that make videos like this that are based mostly on archive visits possible. Special thanks to Andrew for reviewing the script. As always, sources are listed in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.